All right. You'll just see that the people will start joining as attendees as they do. So,
Sam,
so
good to
far.
Sam, good to see you again.
Good to see you, Matt. Good to see you. Do you like my do you like my formal attire? Do you like the tie?
I do. I actually dressed up just a little bit more today than normal, just to hopefully bridge the culture just a little bit more. Instead of
That's good. It's
instead of
good of
my
you.
normal polo or Reese Marks attire, which is fine. Now, is that
My
a what's on that tie there?
this is a nod to our moderator. This is my State College tie from Penn State, my
Uh,
Nittany Lions tie that I picked up
uh,
several years ago when visiting a
trying to
buddy there.
impress Erica and a couple other people in our company and that
So
know that
it's always
that,
good to
that
be in favor with the moderator, Matt, right?
do you know the chant?
I do not know. I'm
Ah,
we would call ourselves a plastic fan here in the UK, so
uh-huh,
I guess I'm
uh-huh.
a
Well, I would say, since we're going to be talking about, cultural differences and all those sorts of things, that the college university sports landscape is the equivalent of what in the South, or the South and the Midwest is the equivalent of what you would see in football
okay.
in Europe. The
Okay.
fandom is crazy. It's nuts. Penn Staters are a different bunch. But they're okay. They're okay.
They are.
I think it's cool.
All
Uh,
right, perfect. So we've got a few attendees that are in. So what I'm going to do is more of the boring part and just do the intro of what this webinar is. And then I'll obviously leave it to Sam and Matt to continue. But my name is Erica Hartz. I'm the Global Partnership Director with Reesmarks Global. My role is making sure to bridge uh, communication and any gap within our services and our partners to help our clients grow internationally. And so naturally, we have a wonderful partnership with Agility EOR. Sam and I have been in contact for years now, and we always share wonderful stories about sort of the differences between the US and the UK way of business. And not only that, but expansion to both regions. So we were chatting and we said we should probably do a webinar on this. So today I am the moderator, but I have two great speakers, one from Agility being Sam, and then one from Reesmarks Global being Matt. So I will leave it to them to start their introductions.
Thanks, Erica. You always lead me in the right direction. So I really appreciate you being a moderator. So, hey, everybody, I see some people joining here. I'm sure some people will continue to join. See some actually common names. Hi, Terry. I know you can't speak, but good to see you. I know we've done a lot of work together, especially across the globe. So good to see some historical clients jumping on here with us. So guys, Matt Mann, I run global sales here at Reesmarks Global. I've been doing this just north of 10 years at this point. I think LinkedIn just told me I started my 11th year. So excited to share what I've learned. I can't believe it's been 11 years. Our company, Nick, one of our leaders, has been here more than 20. Our team has quite a level of experience. So a lot we've learned over the years. And to be honest, I still feel like I'm learning every day. Sam and I have been talking about this webinar for some time now, and some of the things that cultural differences between the UK and the US, I kind of forget about at times because I've been doing it, and our team, we're on the calls every single day. But it's really interesting how these nuances, change and challenge us, and are really important as we expand our businesses. So just a brief 30 seconds on Reesmarks. We're a recruitment firm. We help companies expand globally, right? Why we exist. We're here to help you find the right talent wherever you're trying to expand. A lot of the times we're finding first boots on the ground and then the team that follows. We can find resumes all day long, but it's those other pieces. It's that gray, within the resume, that gray within the human design that we really focus on to make sure that you're finding the right person that can help your company grow for years to come. Sam, I'll throw it over to you.
Thanks, Matt. And just to start with, it's an honor to be doing this with you guys. And as you've just said, it's been really nice to sort of learn from each other as we've chatted through these kind of things. So I'm Sam Barnes. I'm the co-founder and sales director of Agility EOR. We are a UK headquartered employer of record, and we provide compliant employment solutions all around the world. One of the things that's really exciting about today's webinar is this is probably the most well-trodden path still. It has been for many years, businesses in the US looking to employ people in the UK. Unfortunately for you guys, you don't have the option to employ people in the UK under US laws. That's not how it works. We have a whole different set of rules. We're going to look at a bunch of those today. And I think my key message really is it is different, but it needn't be scary. So take the opportunity to get some advice, learn from the right people, and you can certainly employ in the UK with confidence. Yeah, we're not some of the other European countries where there are collective bargaining agreements and unions, and we don't even have 50 states to deal with. We operate under one set of rules. So it's going to be nice and simple, and we'll guide you through some of this today.
Amazing. Okay, so we're going to kick this off with a poll, just to sort of see what everybody's thoughts are on one of the first topics. So I am launching it right now. So the poll is about the talent differences between the US and the UK. And the question is, what are the key differences between hiring talent in the US and the UK? And so the first is legal framework, cultural preferences, hiring processes, compensation norms, and other. We're seeing about a 50-50 split right now of legal frameworks and hiring processes, which is really kind of nice for Sam's side of the conversation, but it's going to be great because Matt will be going through more of that cultural side. Oh, we just popped up with cultural. So I'm going to end the poll here. We've got a perfect split across all three. And that will lead directly into Matt's topic.
Yeah, I think, Sam, I think you and I could probably argue about what's most important for days on end, and I think we'd both be right at the end of the day, because ultimately it's all important, right? I think culture bleeds through everything. I think my overall theme when I started really thinking about, what are the true differences, not just in recruiting talent, but the overall business culture and so on. On the surface, I think the US and the UK, we appear very, very similar. There's a lot of things that bond us, things that maybe drove us apart, but also bring us together, which is always interesting. We're kind of like cousins. In essence, people go, well, we speak the same language. It's like, yeah, but do we? Right? A lot of the times we see things that, an S or a Z, Z versus Z, like all these sort of little things that seem like no big deal, they can be big nuances as you start to expand your business, right? It bleeds into business culture, right? It bleeds into interviewing. It bleeds into how you approach candidates. It bleeds into how you do business, set goals, process, all those sorts of things. In essence, when I look at trying to boil, I mean, there's so many if, ands, or buts about this, but when I really boil down, what the true sort of nature of US talent and UK talent, and there's always exceptions, guys. So, but I'm going to try to paint the broad brush, right? My team knows I make up words quite a bit, so I don't know if this is a word or not, but I look at UK culture as a sense of elevated properness compared to the US, right? Is properness a word? I'm not sure, but to me, it makes sense. Everything that we do, Sam's got a tie on. I don't. I'm actually wearing probably a more proper shirt than I normally do just to make sure that the UK audience understands you need to elevate your game just a little bit, right? Maybe using the word properness is probably wrong. I probably should have used, I mean, Sam, what would you use?
No, I'm taking elevate properness, and I'm taking that. And I'll just let you know, Matt, I've dressed down. I've taken my jacket off for you. So look, we're meeting in the middle already.
There you go. I mean, maybe it's decorum. Maybe I should have used decorum or something like that, right? So there's a whole lot of difference. I mean, I know, guys, this is, as you're listening, these seem like little things and so on, but you'll see when Sam starts to talk about some of the legal things, the policy things, all those sorts of things, this sort of sense of properness bleeds into all of that framework. The other side of this, from a cultural difference, and we'll probably get into it again, and that's something that bleeds into everything that we do, is the ability to take a risk, right? Many times people in the UK, it feels like they don't like to take risk. They're risk averse, where the US is gung ho, let's go, let's not even think about it, build the plane while we're flying it. It's not really true, right? The UK will take the risk, but they'll think about it. They'll build some properness, I'll keep using that word, into it. They'll have a process, they'll think it through constantly. I'll be with my team and we'll start talking about a new project that we're getting on, and they're trying to get every answer before we get to the end, right? We're trying to get every answer before we even start, really. Whereas sometimes you just need to just start, take one step at a time, and then you'll figure it out as you go. And those are just some of those sort of like areas about the culture that tend to flow differently. And it sort of bleeds into all the different parts of the framework, and probably why, as we started this poll question, what is the most important part? Ultimately, I think all of the things matter. Sam, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I particularly like we use the phrase, but build the tracks as the train's coming, right? And that's something that I've seen from US businesses. That tends to make us uncomfortable here in the UK. We have that kind of longer term plan, and I think some of the things that I'll talk about in relation to employment relationships and how we're a bit more tied into those, perhaps relate to that ability to be off the cuff or not.
Okay, interesting. Very, very interesting. Would you say, how would you say that I guess properness plays into, you know, the sort of your perception of a recruitment company, a recruiter or a company approaching you? If you were, I'm sure you've been approached many times. There's a million firms in the UK and there's a million firms in the US. I'm sure you've been approached quite a bit. How do you view a US recruiter reaching out versus a UK recruiter reaching out to yourself?
Well, you're right. You get reach outs quite a lot. Probably I've been subject to more reach outs from UK recruiters. I guess both commonly persistent in approach. It's perhaps as you get further down the road in that recruitment process that you start to see the differences, right? The number of rounds you're expected to go through, the formality of panels, and perhaps then the length of time it takes to make a decision as to whether somebody's going to be hired or not. And again, I think relating that back to how tied in we are in the UK, perhaps we're a bit more careful in that recruitment process to make sure we found the right person in the first place before we want to add them to the roster.
Yeah, no, that sort of tracks with where we usually see different things. And I think maybe a little bit later on we get into, job mobility and the rate of change in the US, especially as you get towards the West Coast. Um, some people stay at companies a long time, but in the West Coast historically, you're seeing a lot of movement, a lot of risk taking, and you've seen a lot of great technologies built because of that. But it's definitely one of those things that you see in the UK, but I think there's more thought and more, all right, this is where I'm going. This is where I want to be in my career. So I'm going to make these steps strategically rather than let's figure it out. I know the end goal, but where are we going? So,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah, we
it,
we 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 certainly move around less here in the UK. If I was looking at somebody else's CV with a view to recruiting, I'm expecting them to have more than 2 years at each place. If they haven't, I'm wondering what's wrong with them. So, that
yeah.
that that frequency of move definitely plays out differently.
Yeah, I think that's something that as the world has become more global, it's becoming a bit more of a hot button our clients always want someone who's showed a staying power wherever they've been. So it's something I think that is changing in the culture. But historically that's definitely a viewpoint that we sort of see. I notice it a lot as we do a lot of work with US companies that are going into new markets for the first time. So we do a lot of upfront, advice, consulting before we start a project. So sort of naturally, I start to look at where are the landmines going to be, right? And so I really try to look at those processes and all those sorts of things. And a lot of times, especially if we're dealing with sales or go-to-market teams, things like that, Sales leaders are a bit more like my innate nature is just let's go, let's figure it out. But when you start to think about if you're going into a new market, you can't just bring your US mindset, right, into the UK. You can't just bring it into Europe or wherever. You need to have that sort of blend. You also can't just, in my opinion, and Sam, I'd love to hear what you think. You can't just say, all right, I'm going to hire someone in the UK that's never worked for a US company or have never dealt with international before and expect it to work and bridge that sort of gap, right? We're minding the gap here in this webinar. So that sort
Yeah.
of like blending of cultures, I think, is so important.
Yeah, I think this is going to be a key takeaway from today's webinar is start from scratch. If you're a US business and you're recruiting somebody in the UK, start with a blank sheet and build up an understanding of what it's likely to be like employing in the UK, rather than perhaps bringing across some of those preconceptions. And both the employer and the employee have got to have some flexibility and some understanding that the cultures are different, the ways of doing things are different. And yes, in that respect, it certainly helps if the candidate's got some experience of international business too.
Yeah, I think this probably leads us into the next almost poll question, Erica. But I think some of the little things, and I remember, just I'll digress a little bit, and it just kind of hit me as we were talking about this, some of the things that I see on a daily basis. But when I first joined Reese Marks, I went over to the UK to meet our team, had a couple business meetings. I was flying to Ireland and a couple other places. And you know, I remember, and this is little things, but again, it's business culture, it's how people think and all that sort of stuff. I remember sitting there with our managing partner at the airport, getting ready to head out to a couple of meetings, and we were having breakfast. And I sort of never forget that I was sitting there, order, eggs or whatever it might be, coffee and everything. I drink my coffee, and if anybody knows me, I drink a lot of coffee, way too much, and probably all day long. So it's just one of my pleasures and vices at the same time. Well, I remember the waitress coming back over, and do you guys want anything else? I just asked for another coffee refill, and she comes back with it, and my managing partner looks over at me, and again, I'm sort of new to the international market at the time. This is about 11 years ago. And essentially he goes, you have to pay for refills here, right? And I know it's like 3 pounds, 2 pounds, or whatever. It was no big deal. But it was one of those things that in the US, you don't pay for coffee refills, right? Unless you're getting something fancy at Starbucks or one of those companies. But when you're at a restaurant, you get free refills, and it's just endless. And it's
Amazing.
kind of one of those things, like it probably didn't hit me too much then, but as I look back at it now and think about all the different decisions that we're making, um, those little things make a big difference in the decision-making tree when you see this sort of cultural nuance. And I think, like, when we look at Germany, France, when we do things in Hong Kong, we do things in Australia, Brazil, it's pretty easy for people to go, oh yeah, that's different. And they think about it and they go forward with it. And it's not an easy, those aren't our easy markets by any stretch, but just the recognition of it's different, right? Languages, culture, very, very different. I think the biggest challenge most people face with the UK is it feels the same,
Mm.
but it's little nuances that shift everything and can cause argument, right? It can cause challenge. But if you can recognize that and work together, there's tons of opportunity there.
Yeah.
Perfect. And that brings us right into the next poll to kick off Sam's portion of it, which would be regarding employment contracts in the US and the UK. So the question is, and I'm going to launch it right now, how do employment contracts differ between the US and the UK? So of course, everybody, you don't have to necessarily be right, and there's no specific right answer. They're all right. But contract types, benefits, working hours, parental leave, which is a big factor, and other. All right.
Ooh, all the fun stuff, Sam.
I'm
But
glad I'm
Sam,
not answering this one.
I'm glad there's people like you and companies like you because I I know these are important, but I don't like the details. So, but they are important.
So we had a majority saying that the contract types were sort of the differentiate or the sort of biggest one out of the differences versus the benefits and the parental leave, which I find benefits surprising just because the US and the UK are just so vastly different of how that looks in an offer. But I will have the specialist talk on that.
Yeah.
So Sam, feel free to go through.
Yeah, just before I launch on this slide, I think that's a really interesting response to the poll. And to be honest, I'd have copped out and I'd have just gone with other because I think all of those things are so important and they're all related to this kind of contractual piece that we have here in the UK. Um, so I'm going to start with the biggie here. This really is like a kind of a huge difference. So in the US, by exception, you guys have the concept of at-will employment. So employer and employee entering into a relationship that at any point, if they don't like it, they can just walk away from it. So I think that kind of gives everybody a kind of a greater freedom immediately than we've got here in the UK. So outside of the US, we don't have employment at will. It's not a thing. And here in the UK, everything is done very formally with employment contracts. So what that means is that other than like in the first week when you don't have to give somebody notice, or in a case of what we call gross misconduct, so some violence or theft or terrible insubordination where you might dismiss somebody kind of immediately, other than in those situations, you're always going to give somebody some kind of notice, and you're always going to give somebody, there's always going to be a procedure to follow. In fact, even in that scenario where somebody walks into the office and punches a colleague on the nose in front of loads of witnesses, there's still a procedure that we have to go through to do these things. So we are much more kind of structured in the way that we do these things. And I think what that means for employer and employee is we don't enter into the employment relationship very lightly in the first place, right? So both employer and employee want to know that we're going to get on with each other, that we're expecting it to last for a long time, and we want to know what's going to happen if it doesn't work out and we don't want to work together anymore. So importantly, here in the UK, employment always governed by an employment contract must be signed at the start of the employment relationship, usually on day one between the two parties. So I think that's the first point. Um, Matt, you alluded to this earlier, and I think the saying is something along the lines of two nations divided by a common language.
Mhm.
So I thought it'd be interesting to look at some terminology here.
Yep.
And these kind of terminologies and different use of the same words can lead to a lot of confusion, right? So in the UK, and I'm here to give the UK perspective. In the UK, when we talk about an offer letter, we're talking about a one-page accompaniment to the employment contract. So the offer letter tells me very little more than I already knew from talking to the recruiter. It'll have headline stuff like the salary, and maybe in the future I'll refer back to it to find out what my previous salary was. But in and of itself, I'm not bothered about receiving the offer letter. The handbook here in the UK is the kind of the what, for want of a better term, I'll call the fluffier stuff, right? So it's kind of what's your social media policy? Who do I have to tell if I'm going to have a day off sick? If I'm not feeling very well, who do I call? It's going to have all the vision and values and company-based stuff. It doesn't house any of the kind of important terms that the relationship is based on. In the UK, it's all about employment contracts. So employment contracts have got wages, they've got the probationary period, they've got my duties, they've got how many hours I'm going to work. At Agility, we provide employment contracts as the first step. Our UK employment contract is 12 pages long, and it's not unusual for it to have custom clauses added to it when we send it out to clients.
Wow.
Um, and I talk about some of the confusion that this can lead to, because what happens is my US based client is saying to me, Sam, we've got to get the offer out like immediately because it's really important. And I'm thinking, why is this so important? Surely you've already told the candidate that you're going to offer them a job. Why do you want to send them an offer letter and not the employment contract? Or they might say to me, Sam, are you guys going to take responsibility for writing our handbook and providing that for us? And I'm thinking, Why am I writing your handbook? These are your company specific policies. You decide how you want, people to use company IT equipment or not. Um, and equally, on the other hand, I'm saying when I send you the employment contract, I'm going to give you a few days to digest that, and you can come back to me and ask questions, and we'll give you consultancy around that. And my US client is thinking, why are you giving me time to do this employment contract? Why is it so important? Well, because it's the rules that you're now going to have to stick by. And if you breach the rules, you're going to be in trouble, and your UK employee is going to be taking you to court because you've breached a rule in the employment contract. So really important to give
Yeah, but Sam,
people.
all that matters is the number, the commission structure, and that's it, right?
No, absolutely not right. No, no. I want to know what point these rules start to kick in. I want to know what happens if I'm off sick. Well, in what circumstances are you going to pay me if I'm on parental leave? I need to know all of these things before we can start.
And you know what's interesting about that? Because I know a lot of US hiring managers that all of a sudden, when that conversation starts happening, they start to go, this person's not motivated. They don't want to be here. Why are they already planning to fail?
That's how it comes across.
Sometimes, yep. Yeah.
Yeah,
You
that's
start, you
really
start,
interesting.
you start thinking about the end before you started. Certain people get to that moment of like, hmm, is this person not confident? Right? Why are they asking these questions? Why would I send a contract to a lawyer? Right?
Okay.
An employment contract, it's just a job.
Yeah. Yeah.
Those
Now
are
on
things
the
that, yeah,
on the
those,
other end of that, Sam, if you were a candidate and you were doing your due diligence as you would, and an American company came and said, well, now we're worried you see risk in this. How would you perceive that as a candidate? Would you then even want to pursue with the company if they had their alarms by your normal processes?
Yeah, it could be quite off-putting, to be honest. I think I want somebody to give me the opportunity. I guess that would come across to me as the candidate is this company fly by night? Are they not taking it
yeah,
seriously? So probably the same things that US company is thinking about the candidate's thinking about the company.
yeah. And then Sam, I know we talked a little bit before the webinar to try to plan and prepare, and that was one thing I didn't really plan or prepare for. And it's kind of interesting how you react to it, right? It's like, ooh, that's the real, and that's real. That we see it all the time. And I see these things with these offer, like everything you're talking about with the language and the offer letters, the handbooks, the employee contracts. Most US companies, they kind of think about it, but I know there's some HR people on the call. I know there's some salespeople on the call, sales leaders, and depending on who you're talking about, it can be really different how what they've thought about. Good HR people who have been doing this for a long time understand they have to consider those pieces. The
Yeah.
sales leaders who are maybe doing this for the first time in an international market, they just need the person to start producing revenue. That's what they care about, right?
I,
So
I,
these
I
things, it's so important that the education that you're giving here, it's so important that you can bridge that with your clients to make sure that when that situation happens in the interview, right, it makes a difference how the perception is on both sides. So it takes
mm,
it takes a lot to make sure that we talk through the situation, who's managing the candidate to walk them back from the ledge when the US hiring team makes a little bit of a nervous assumption, vice versa.
mm.
Who's walking the US company back from that nervous ledge when all it is just cultural norms that are colliding.
Yeah, the cultural norms being perceived differently by the other side. And I think we're going to see in these last couple of talking points, I think you're going to have some of the same comments here. Actually, I can already see this, that the perception it's going to have when perhaps somebody in the UK is asking quite reasonably about how much time they get off. You're thinking as a US employer, well, surely you're interested in what's going on while you're working. You should be giving me your pound of flesh, not wondering how many days a year you're going to get off. And yeah, these
Yeah.
these last 2 points, working hours and paid time off, these are factors in the employment contract, and we have again statutory rules around this, right? So a lot of the things that go in an employment contract are statutory provisions. There are minimum things that you have to do if you're an employer in the UK, and you can't choose. And if you don't do these things, an employer again might well take you to court or perhaps just leave you. So when we look at working hours, we're typically working 37.5 to 40 hours a week. We have something called the Working Time Directive here in the UK that says we don't work more than 48 hours a week. And while professionals here don't get paid overtime, we're also not expecting to work overtime. Now, of course, it's not entirely black and white. More senior roles might be, might be doing more overtime, and not being paid for it. But generally speaking, it's not a cultural expectation to be working 60-hour weeks. Similarly, we don't work when we're on holiday. Right. So
Mm.
I previously worked
Yep.
for a US employer. I learned this the hard way. I said to my boss in America, I'm going on holiday. Should I be taking my laptop? He said to me, if you were one of my US team, you wouldn't even be asking the question. So a very quick way to learn that. But from a US employer's perspective, you should be considerate about what the UK employee thinking, hey, this is about my work-life balance. I need my downtime. That's how they're looking at it.
Yeah,
I think
the phrase work-life balance is an interesting one this day. I think the new generation, Sam, is even in the US is centering that point a little bit more than they ever used to. But I'm curious and sorry to interrupt, but
no.
and I guess maybe that's some of the UK US thing as well. So I tend to
I'd
interrupt a
expect
little bit.
nothing less, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, it happens, and it's the only way I can get a word in my household too. So, but anyway, so working hours, paid time off, overtime, not overtime. Since 2020, we've seen a massive shift in the globalization, right, of the workforce. And we've seen a big shift in how, at least from our perspective, of how companies are sort of absorbing what's happening around the world and hours worked, hours not worked, and things like that. We deal mostly with tech companies, SaaS companies. I know you guys are right in that same sort of arena, right? Mid-cap companies that are expanding and moving quickly. A lot of private equity, venture capital type back companies, I'm sure. Have you seen a shift since 2020? In terms of I know legally in compliance, right? Spot on where you are, but have you seen a shift on how that's perceived at all? Or has it stayed, for the last 10 or 15 years about the same from a UK perspective?
So obviously since 2020, we've seen a massive shift in globalization generally. I think in the current political climate on both sides of the pond, we're seeing things that are changing very quickly and a need to keep up with those changing rules. And I think one thing I've really noticed is we're measuring stuff more, right? We're recording stuff more. So in our own technologies, we're recording timesheets, and it's slightly maybe about covering our back in case somebody suggests that we've asked somebody to do more than they were expecting to.
Mhm.
So yeah, I think my perception is that we're measuring stuff more and covering our backs more.
Interesting.
Quick question that came through the chat, Sam, and then we'll push it to the next topic. Was our offer letters similar to letter of intent, and are letter of intents legally binding in the UK? Because they can be in the US, depending on the state and how they're sent across.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question actually. So we use the terminology offer letter. Letter of intent, perhaps not so much. I have seen it, so I would imagine they're the same sort of thing. What's really important, really interesting is we are so you have to be really careful here in the UK before you even enter into the employment relationship. So at the point that you've made an offer to somebody, even a verbal offer, they've got legal protections. Even in the interview process, they've got legal protections. If they feel that the reason that you didn't take them on was in some way discriminatory or unfair, they can already take you to court before they're your employee. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. I think offer letter and letter of intent very, very similar, and you certainly do need to be careful right from the point at which you issue those. They will be legally binding and get you into an employment relationship.
Awesome. Great question, Mike. And if you guys do have any questions, you can throw it in the question box or the chat box directly to me, and I can sort of send those through or mention them on. Okay, next slide, we're going to jump right into poll 3. Just give me 1 second. Now, this topic will be about cultural considerations. So what cultural considerations should US companies be aware of when hiring in the UK? Communication style, attitude towards hierarchies, work-life balance, humor in the workplace, other. I think humor in the workplace is kind of a really intriguing one. I'm not sure it would be voted on for this, but just the humor differences between the US and UK is subtle, but vastly different. So I think
What do you
that's
mean,
more.
like when Sam tells me a joke and I don't know it's a joke? That one?
Yes, exactly. When the sarcasm goes far above a US individual's head.
I Again, it's a little bit more of that properness that I spoke about. It's just too sophisticated, I think, you know.
hmm So it looks like work-life balance is the bigger piece of it, which ties into everything that Sam just went through as well when we talk about holiday time off or vacation time off, as it's spoken about in the US. But communication style is in there and other. So I'm intrigued. Whoever clicked other, whether it be a couple
Yeah,
people or
throw a
whatever,
question in
please
there.
throw it in the chat of what you think what should be aware of when it comes to cultural considerations. So with that. We will jump
Hey,
right
Eric,
into.
I'll jump in just kind of talking about work-life balance. And I think we've touched on this sort of a little bit ebb and flow throughout the talk here. Um, like I don't know if I'm a little bit different, but I think the culture at our company is a little bit more uh, not too worried about work-life balance. It's more about we got to get the job done. We're sort of on a mission and we're accelerating and all that sort of stuff. But we also try to make sure, and our US and European team are very different in terms of the process and the procedures and the number of days off and how we take it and how we schedule it, for sure. But I think from a mission standpoint, our company sort of takes a lot of ownership in who they are, what they do in their job. And I think I start to see that a lot more globally. But I think that is something you see a little bit different. We work with a lot of private equity, venture capital startups that are sort of going through that rocket ship growth. And you see sort of this lack of like, we don't worry about the time off. We don't worry about that sort of stuff because we got to get the job done. But then it's starting to change. So I would say from a perspective of the cultural difference, that's sort of that sort of like gray zone in the US. You'll see that sort of like we're almost afraid to say we need the time off. Again, generationally, that's changing. You're starting to see the younger generation, they care more about that stuff, especially at the big tech companies, right? You're seeing the larger companies. There's definitely a lot more process and emphasis on, how many days off, what the office culture looks like, whether it's hybrid or not, those sorts of things. But when a lot of the clients we work with, right, it is that mid-market where they're accelerating, they're growing, and they don't really have time to take off. You see sort of a different animal. Just for instance, just looking at Reese Marks, how we operate, our US vacation policy is unlimited vacation, right? Take time, do what you got to do. We do say you need to take time, right? You need to recharge and really recharge, not just take time with your laptop and phone. I'm probably the worst offender of all of this, but actually taking time to recharge, regroup, and the rest of the team will pick you up. But it's not really defined, right? You kind of get your job done, do what you got to do. If you need the time, take it. There's no sort of formal review of when you can, when you can't. As long as things are covered, and we kind of look at it, take ownership in your role, right? Take ownership in what you do and make sure things are taken care of. Where our UK team, I think the mentality is a little bit of the same, but there definitely is more of a formal. You have 20 or 25 days. Sam, I don't know, you're the expert on the number of days that it should be, depends on how long they've been there and all that sort of stuff. But there's definitely that sort of culture of there's so many days, and if you don't use them by a certain time period, you end up losing that and all that sort of stuff. So there's definitely more formality around time off and all those sorts of pieces.
Yeah.
There's definitely a lot of discussion around holiday time, right? And I'm talking bank holidays and things like that. In the US, there's very few holidays that we really kind of shut down for. Christmas, things like that. Memorial Day is sort of a big one for us, Veterans Day. But in the UK, you have all the bank holidays that, I look at as days where I can catch up on a lot of good stuff because there's a lot less emails. And you see our UK team and completely off, right? They're recharging. I'm not saying the Americans have it right at all. Maybe we can learn something. But from a cultural standpoint, that's what you tend to see for the most part. That you have this sort of looseness around vacation time in the US. Somewhat it's changing with the generations that are coming.
It makes me feel uncomfortable, Matt. When I think about US policies of unlimited leave, I instinctively think, yeah, but surely if you take more than 10 days, you won't have a job when you come back, kind of thing. So it almost feels like it's not, yeah, that's not real. And for me as a business founder, I guess in the same way, I have an unlimited leave policy. Nobody's kind of tracking it, but I don't like that. That's not good for me. I want to know these are my 20 days, 25 days. And I've ticked them off as I've gone. Interesting, you mentioned the number of days of holiday that we get because it is 20 days plus the 8 bank holidays. But if you
Mhm.
offered me, Matt, if you were a US employer and you said to me, well, you have your statutory 20 days and 8 bank holidays, far more than we get in the US, I would think you were a stingy employer. I want 25 days as a minimum. So be
Mhm.
aware of that one as well.
Yeah, we've been in that negotiation many times and educating our clients on that. It's one of those things where, you know, my sort of attitude and kind of how I talked about it, that's how I've always sort of viewed it. And we hear our clients, but we understand, we've been doing this long enough, we understand we have to see both sides. And that's the best way to make sure that our clients are doing what they need to do to flourish, right? Because you don't want to go into a market and hire somebody and start off on the bad foot, right? You want to make sure everybody's excited about where they're going. But yeah, no, it's interesting. The unlimited policies, all that sort of stuff, Sam, it is a very different mindset. And I think if you build the culture you want and hire the people that you feel will buy into the culture that you're trying to build as a company, forget UK and US culture, but the company culture, that tends to either initiate that sort of, ooh, I don't know about this unlimited. That means I can't take time off. Or that
Mm,
means, you know what, they trust me as long as I'm producing, as long as I'm driving results. It's a very sort of results driven environment. You kind of mentioned you see it, UK's measuring more now,
definitely.
measuring more. And I can see where that comment that you made about, ooh, that would make me worried, because we're measuring, who took time off, who did this, who did that, when that sort of unlimited is real. The intent around that was about, all right, this is about results. Let's get the job done. It doesn't necessarily mean work harder. It means work smarter, which kind of is the attempt to make that business culture work about results rather than I worked 8 hours, so my job is done. Um,
Mm.
Certainly every company kind of takes it in their own direction.
Mm. Matt, next time we'll talk about mainland Europe and some of those things. And I think the UK's proximity to mainland Europe and the next level rules they've got there and the actual requirements to measure exactly what people are working and the far worse penalties probably make us here in the UK nervous because we might know what's coming next.
Yep. Uh-huh. I totally agree. Totally agree.
Wonderful. Okay, so now we're going into our final poll and section, which is the differences in competitive offers. And the question is, should be loaded for you. Which of these benefits differs the most between the two countries, UK and the US? Healthcare coverage, paid leave, retirement contributions, maternity and paternity leave, and then other, of course, as well. I'm seeing retirement contributions are sort of the leading. Other is clicked again. So we didn't get the in the comment section what other was last time, but I urge you if you click that, please let me know what your thoughts are. Maternity
Where's
and
all of the
paternity
above?
leave. Oh yeah, it could be all of the above. Absolutely.
I'm amazed healthcare coverage isn't coming out as being the rampant winner of this one.
It's actually the only thing that has been not clicked at this point. So I'm going to share the results where they sit. We had an
Fantastic.
even breakdown of paid leave, retirement, and maternity and paternity leave, and healthcare coverage was the only one not clicked. So that will be interesting
Fascinating.
going into your next slide.
Yeah, I mean, we've picked here benefits and termination procedures as just two elements of things that are really different here in the UK. And let's be honest, we could have picked hundreds of things that we could have sort of focused on in this kind of depth. But um, let's start with employee benefits and compensation. And as with so many things, differences between our two countries, much of this is based on statutory provisions. So when we're talking about the UK offering benefits, these are often things that you must do. They're not supplementary benefits. So we have our social security. This is national insurance, as we call it. It pays for paternity leave, maternity leave, and it pays for our NHS, our National Health Service. And there's also a requirement on employers to offer a pension contribution. It's mandatory, employees can opt out, but it's a must-have for employer and employee to be enrolled into it in the first place. Personal bugbear of mine, please don't do this if you're recruiting in the UK, is to offer the generous package of benefits of paid leave, sick pay, and paid holidays when these things are all mandatory. These are not benefits. If you're going to say we've got a generous offering of benefits, make it an enhancement on top of what you'd normally get as a statutory requirement. One really interesting one here. When I work with US clients, all 9 times out of 10, we'd like to give some equity. How do we give equity when we're working through an EOR? Nobody in the UK is expecting to get equity in your company. It's really unusual for us. You might get paid a bonus commission scheme, something like that, but we're not expecting to get a slice of the pie. So that's something I very often see as a difference between the two. Um, so when we look at the total cost of benefits, and I ran some figures this morning, another thing that is sometimes a concern to US clients is it's going to cost a lot more to have somebody here because you've got to pay Social Security and you've got to pay pension. But actually, when you do a side by side, and I did this on a pretend salary of $100,000 for somebody working in New York versus the equivalent in London, it's almost exactly the same amount of money by the time you've paid your statutory taxes and insurances and made a reasonable provision for health insurance versus our pension and social security. So don't think it's going to be more expensive having somebody in the UK. So that's not necessarily the case. Um, key takeaways in relation to benefits. Don't think that you have to offer what you offer in the US and what you offer in the UK. So start from scratch, learn what's required in the UK and do just that. If you are offering enhanced benefits, make sure they are enhanced. Don't just offer the statutory minimums and call those things benefits and expect the cost to be broadly similar. Let's look at the other one, termination. This is a real one. This is one that people need to be careful of because we've got a lot of rules around this, and we're back to Matt, our British process and formality in the way that we do things. It's one not to get wrong because employees have protections all the way through, and particularly after 2 years, it's very easy for an employee to take an employer to court for unfair dismissal. You can take them for wrongful dismissal or for constructive dismissal, right? An employer making it uncomfortable for an employee to be there to the point where the employee resigns. That's called constructive dismissal, and they're all bad. There are going to be processes. There is going to be notice, but here's a really valid thing. Don't think you're going to be stuck with an employee, right? We're not, and there are European countries where you might not be able to part company with the employee. In the UK, if somebody's incompetent, if they're being insubordinate, if there simply isn't enough work for them, then you might have to document some stuff. You might have to tell them what they're doing wrong. Maybe you've got to wait a little while so that you can record those things. Then you're going to give them their notice and then they can leave. So you're never going to be in a situation where you're stuck with an employee maybe after a month or two. We should here touch upon probationary periods. So it's normal in the UK to have that trial period at the beginning, 3, most commonly 6 months, during which time you'd part company with an employee with just a week's notice. Not much the employee can do about it, again, so long as there's been no discrimination or anything like that. So if you've got an employee in the UK, monitor that probationary period. If you feel it's not working out with them, make sure you've terminated that employment before the 6 months is up and the end of the probationary period.
Yeah.
So I think, bottom line advice, to take advice from a professional in the UK, on employment law, understand what termination is going to look like. Matt, I know that's going to make people uncomfortable thinking about the end before when they're only at the beginning,
Yep.
but it's important to do. And do not act on something the way that you would do in the US, because it's probably going to land you in hot water.
Yeah, Sam, all these are pretty important points. And it's sometimes I laugh and kid a little bit about how it's too processed and all that sort of stuff. But when you start to talk about things that can end up in litigation and risk, you really you gotta plan for that, right? And those things tend to not happen often, but when they do, they can cause a big problem. And I think the UK is a fairly simple place to operate and understand and all that sort of stuff. When we start getting into other parts of Europe, it is much more complex. It's much more tricky. The fines are worse. There's a lot more sticky situations that you won't even think about. So the UK is a pretty safe place to go. I think all these things with the right partners, you can get through pretty easy. But what I will say is what's nice about the UK and I'm sure each sort of like county or area, London's probably different from Manchester and so on. But that's where the US probably is a little bit more complex, from an employment law standpoint, is you now have basically 50 countries to
Yeah.
really think about all these different pieces. Not every state is right to hire, right to fire. Most are. Not every state is at will. So there are different things. I mean, something, in an interview process that you do need to know that you don't have to worry about from a recruiting perspective, or company perspective in the US, you can't necessarily ask a candidate what their salary is, right? In certain areas, California, Boston, New York, Chicago, not all states are equal in terms of what you can and can't ask. It's one of the actually probably the few areas that the US can be a bit more complex in terms of employment law and so on. And the whole reason that stuff was brought up is to try to get pay equity where it needs to be. But so those are certain things to consider. So when I do consult with a US company who's trying to understand the UK for the first time, I try to make that sort of comparison is if you understand the differences in the US states where you have to really be careful of certain questions that you ask, processes that you go through, it's the same in the UK. But with the UK, it's probably actually a little bit easier because once you learn the UK, that's it. It's there.
Yeah.
Versus the state, you got 50 opportunities to make mistakes.
Yeah. People will ask me, hey, do you guys employ in Wales or in Scotland? Till the UK, it's fine. It's the same set of rules, so absolutely no problem. Yeah. Understand the rules. They're not onerous. Play by the rules, and nobody's going to end up into trouble.
Mhm.
Wonderful. All right. So next is just the final thoughts. We'll take probably about the next 2 to 5 minutes just to go through final thoughts. And we had some questions pop through. So we'll probably extend past the 12 o'clock Eastern mark, 5 o'clock UK mark. If you can join and listen to the answer to the question, that's fine. But also we have this recorded. So if you have to jump off, no worries. And now I will leave, I guess, Matt, you can go first because yours is the first picture. Just any final thoughts you have on the presentation.
Yeah, look, I think I had all these notes and all these things and places to go, and I probably didn't really reference any of them. I think just Sam, you bring up so many different good points that it just naturally flows from where I can kind of see from the past 11 years of where, either mistakes have been made or successes have been won, right? We've been doing this a long time. I think one of the biggest things that I always like to make sure people understand is things change all the time. So we constantly have to question, right? We constantly have to ask the experts. We constantly have to validate, to make sure that we are doing things correct. Look, nobody likes to talk politics. right? But I think we probably should. That's probably a whole nother webinar we could get into, Sam. The what you talk about politics in an interview or not, and all that sort of stuff. But policy shifts, policy change, which affects all of this, right? It affects everything from a standpoint of a legal piece of it. And culture affects policy shift, right? So I find that interesting. But ultimately, I think the biggest takeaway I get when talking about these culture differences, really, you know, expanding your business, it's not just a legal or logistical experience, right? Those things are massively important. In the UK, it's not as difficult as it would be in France or Germany. Nothing wrong with those regions, just a little bit more difficult. There's great opportunity still. Um, but it's also a cultural shift. And so many companies that we've seen over the years either send, from a US perspective, send over a US person to do the job and it doesn't work, or they hire someone who's just in the UK or just in Germany, has only worked for a UK company, and that doesn't work either, right? Finding someone that really understands how to bridge or blend that gap and blend the cultures is so important. One of the things that we put into practice here at Reesmarks is we make sure that we are crossing both sides of the pond as we're screening candidates. So we have teams across the globe, but we always try to make sure that candidates are hearing from someone that's either local or semi-local to that area, but also getting sort of that cross-cultural screen, whether it's the account manager or another recruiter on our US team, so that we are making sure that those people understand they're going to be communicating back and forth. Again, it's not just gratifying their English speaking skills, because if you talk to Sam and Nick, who's on our team, my English is not great at all, but I think it's okay. But again, it's the nuances. Pay attention, be curious, ask those things. It tends to take care of itself and you'll have a great business. Really plan it out. If you're a US company, plan things out, talk to experts, understand the end goal, and take a look at where you need to make sure that you consider how the UK thought process is. So just put that attention to that, and you'll do a lot of great things.
Awesome. Sam?
Yeah, Matt, that's a lovely summary, and I've enjoyed the of this interactiveness. There you go. I'm making up words now of this discussion, and I too had made some notes, but some of the questions that you asked me were were really interesting bits and really interesting segues. I think one thing that you touched upon earlier was the kind of I think subtleties of the way that perhaps we do things and the way that we communicate in the UK. And I think you can take that right back to the hiring process and some of the things that perhaps we won't say as candidates here in the UK, right? We could be a really, really good candidate, but we're never going to tell you, well, I hit 2000% of my target, or I was the best salesperson in the company 6 quarters in a row. So look out for those subtleties of communication in interviews and throughout the employment. If you're going to take somebody on here, we might say something like, oh, that's really interesting. We don't mean that's really interesting. We mean, I'm going to need to take that away and think about it, digest it, and maybe I'm not even on board with it. So, and that works both ways. I'm sure there are things that an American employer might say to a person in the UK that we don't take quite the right way. And coming into it with that empathy that things will be different is really important. And my final piece would be, and Matt, you're absolutely right. We don't talk politics habitually, but whatever your politics, we definitely are in a rapidly changing time, and having experts on your side whose job it is to keep their finger on the pulse when things change, particularly in relation to employment law, is absolutely vital. And I think certainly that's one of the things that we try really hard to do on behalf of our clients.
Fantastic. Well, Erica, thank you for moderating this, putting this together. You always steer us in the right direction. So hopefully the audience learned something. And there's a lot of details, and it depends flows out of my mouth too much. But if anybody does have further questions, just reach out to Sam or I or Erica, and more than happy to talk through those those nuances and make sure that you guys are growing your business and not worried about the little bit of risk that it takes.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everybody. Those that need to jump off, feel free. We have this recorded as well, so this will be shot out. So if there's any things you want to rehear or you heard it, but you want to get it sort of accurately, whatever, we've got the contact information. So we will push this out in about a week or so. All right, jumping right into the questions. So we have a couple for each speaker. Matt, I'll start with you. How can the US companies effectively recruit talent in the UK to retain the talent long term?
Erica, that's a good question. I think I paused a little intentionally there. I think people try to fill the space too quickly sometimes and really think about it. Because my brain first went to, let me just talk about that, but your end of that question was more important, to retain them for a long time, right? And versus just recruiting someone, it's pretty normal. But to actually find someone who's there, that's going to be there for the long run and work well with your company, I think that's the key. Early planning to me is the most important part. In the US, like we've talked about the whole webinar, there's a lot of build the plane while we're flying it. The interview process tends to be, we kind of have an idea, these three people are important, and you kind of hire on feel and trust and gut feel and all that sort of stuff. Of course, you always do, assessments and all those sorts of things, but it doesn't always feel as well thought out as I see when our European or UK counterparts are really building a process. So to really do that, define your goal. Why are you expanding to the UK? Massively important, right? If you don't know that reason, start there. The why is so important. That way you can communicate that to the candidate pool and attract the best. If you don't do that, you might get some good candidates. You might get candidates, but they're not going to be the ones that you're looking for, right? You're going to get active people on the job market, maybe people that are just like looking for work, but the people that are looking to join something different, join something special, you need to define that why. And then the rest sort of falls into place. Help really define your process, define the type of benefits that you want to give, in addition, right, to what you have to give. Make sure you understand all those pieces, and then really lay that out for the candidate, right? Make sure you understand how you're going to employ them. Those things are really important. Understand that the candidates may ask questions that make you think, "Ooh, why are they already thinking about the end?" Again, that's normal. So understand those pieces so you don't miss out on a great candidate that's just talking about the normal pieces. But also think about those different cultures, what your company needs to have in somebody. There are people in the UK that really understand the US culture. There's plenty of them. And you can find those people that make a big impact and really bridge that difference.
Yeah. Oh, Erica's on mute.
Sorry. Sam, is there anything that you would want to add to that
Well,
question?
I mean, I think just very briefly, like a first date, right? First impressions count for a lot. So that induction piece, certainly, if I'm a UK candidate, I'm going into a job and somebody lays out what the future is going to look like for me, gives me a really good picture of what it looks like today. I'm a UK candidate. I want to be in it for the long term. We've already established that we don't hop around too much over here. So yeah, lay it out for me. I agree with you, Matt. Show me the plan. Share with me.
Perfect. Okay. Sam, a question directly for you. What are the differences in termination and dismissal procedures? I know that you briefly touched on this, but it would be nice to sort of go a little bit more in depth for UK employment.
Yeah, I think so obviously Matt mentioned that maybe not everywhere in the US is an at-will state, but I think that the differences in termination here in the UK, there will always be some procedure to go through. So first thing is understand what the reason is for the termination, then understand what does that mean about the process. So if it's a redundancy, for example, there's not enough work for somebody, you're going to have to show that it's not to do with the individual, it's to do with that pool of people. The role is made redundant, not the individual. You're going to have to document that. If it's a large group of people, then you might have to go through some kind of consultation process. There's going to be a timeline to it. There will be a cost to it as well. That cost might only be paying the person to carry on working while you're taking them through the process. And then for their notice period, that's the other piece, the notice period. Contractually, we'll have a notice period in our employment contract. As standard, that's going to be 1 month. For more senior roles, that could be 3 months, maybe even 6 months for a very senior role. And then with our tenure with the company, we increase our statutory entitlement to notice period as well. So a week for a year, up to about 3 months, I believe, is the total. 12 weeks is the total. So expect a process, expect some cost for the notice period.
Sam, I think that was a great question, and the notice period you just really touched on. I think we sort of just glossed over that in the whole webinar, which I'll be honest, that's one of the most surprising things when US companies are going somewhere overseas. You know, UK is not too bad in terms of it can be negotiable and all that sort of stuff, but the US, the culture right around giving notice it'd be nice. Give me 2 weeks, right? It's kind of it's nice type of thing. Sometimes companies will just walk you right out the door if you give notice too. Sometimes you get more, but again, it's not. Some executives, right, will have things into their contract, so that's sort of a different animal. But in general, employment law of giving notice, it's very different in the US. It's more of a gentleman, agreement, per se, whereas in the UK and other places, it is contractual, right? And that's a very different thought process.
Yeah, and not only contractual, and you're right, Matt, there are instances where we could negotiate, employer and employee here in the UK could agree, hey, let's only have 2 weeks notice. Pretty soon, statutory will overtake contractual, and it won't matter what you wrote down in the employment contract. The greater period of time is the one that counts. So if statutory entitlement is greater, even if you'd agreed 2 weeks, before long you'll have a month's notice.
And people work that notice, and what does a
Yeah, but
salesperson do for 4 weeks when they're leaving?
right, so you can put them on garden leave. That absolutely happens. You can pay them not to come into the office. That's fine, but they're at least going to be paid for that month while they go and find the next thing to do.
Okay, interesting.
It's a nice deal. US should catch on to that.
But it works both ways. Don't forget, it gives the employer. So this is an important thing about notice periods. They're reciprocal, right? So of me as an employer, I know I've got the same workforce next month as I've got this month, and I can plan my business to and capacity around that. So there are some comforts for the employer as well as benefit to the employee.
That actually brings up a good sort of follow-up question, at least on my end, is with the employee staying for a certain amount of time, do you find that the drive and the abilities within the role sort of stay consistent throughout that time frame? Especially if they're sort of let go and then they have that notice period, do you feel like they still work in the same ways that they would if they were fully employed without, risk of being fired? Because I think in the US, at least from my take, the minute that they give notice or they're fired, they're either going to stop working completely and just take maybe the 2 weeks that they're guaranteed, or they're walked out the same day because the employer knows that they're not going to work to the same capacity.
So are you asking, Erica, does the protection I've got of my 1 month notice period make me less inclined to work or not work as well, perhaps during my tenure? Or do you mean after somebody's been terminated that they are not going to work for that last month?
Well, I more so just, are they as determined to do as good of a job in that time frame?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not on anybody's radar here in the UK that, hey, I've got the fail-safe of that 1 month notice period. We would be, even if given a 1 month notice period, we're probably still panicking about going and finding our next job in that time. So that's absolutely not a disincentive to put the effort in. Nobody's thinking about that. And like in any role, of course, it comes down to the manager to keep people motivated and to make sure that they're working to the best of their ability. So no, I absolutely wouldn't say that people's propensity to work deteriorates over time just because they're protected by statutory notice period.
To know. Jumping into another question for Matt, what should U.S. companies know about notice periods when hiring? Which actually that was probably just answered. So we'll go to the next question for him. What other support or services are needed and offered to help U.S. companies hire overseas? So I think that's directed at, and both of you guys could probably answer this, but Matt, what other services does Reesmarks provide to help with hiring overseas beyond the recruitment, and Sam as well?
Yeah, so I think the question is, what services do we provide? So recruiting is obviously the core of our business, and it handles all the human elements of everything we've just spoken about. But when we start to look at the legality of everything, and actually, why we partner with people like Sam, is to make sure that when we have the right candidate, right, we can now employ them legally and protect the candidate as well as the company that we're working with. So we offer services around background checks. We offer services around salary benchmarking. A lot of what we do during the recruitment process, we do a lot of services within the interviewing guidance standpoint and consulting. We do a lot of analysis about the market, for instance, pay bands, benefits, what's expected. A lot of times, as Sam would say, right, it's the statutory plus, and a lot of our clients are like, oh, if they get all the statutory, why do they need? What else do they need? And it's like, oh, great candidates that you're trying to pull over or pull away from something, you need to have that pull factor, right? Most people in the UK also have private medical. It's not just the statutory help, right? They have private pension. It's not just a statutory pension. So they have these additional pieces. Car allowances, all that sort of stuff tends to be sort of the next level of managers, executives, things like that you start to see. So from a service standpoint, again, recruiting is the core of what we do, but all of those ancillary things within the HR ecosystem that help build the contract, understand compensation factors, salary benchmarking, market analysis, market entry, impact, are all things that we work on and do consulting with our clients.
Yeah, I mean, from our perspective, as I said at the top of the call, Agility provides a packaged solution which facilitates compliant employment. What does that mean? Unpack that. And I have to give clients kind of a shopping list of things that we do. It's all of that. We've created an entity. We've already got a bank account set up. We do the foreign exchange for you. We provide the benefits. We administer statutory benefits and supplementary benefits. We're running a payroll, so we're calculating taxes and social securities. As I've said, there are those particular social security elements and statutory pension provisions that have got to be calculated. And then, of course, we're dispensing HR advice. So there's a whole lot of stuff, and it's all neatly packaged together. And I would say that US businesses either need to understand the shopping list and get all of those things separately, or get some kind of a packaged solution such as an EOR.
Wonderful. And then probably the last question to round this out, directed at Sam. And there are two questions that came in, and you might be able to answer both in one because they've been mentioned both in their own ways. How should U.S. companies approach compliance when hiring in the U.S. or when hiring in the UK? And why is it important for companies to understand employment laws before expanding? So I think the compliance and just understanding what you're getting into, if you want to sort of answer those.
So how should they approach compliance?
Yes, how should they approach the compliance? And why I say it ties with the next one is because of the importance of understanding the employment laws and working with a firm like yourself that might go hand in hand.
Yeah, so the first piece, and I know this sounds painfully obvious, but honestly, I see this all the time, is understand that you're employing under UK employment laws. The number of times we see, hey, well, this is how we do it at home. We're gonna do it the same way in the UK. You're not, you can't. It's got to be done under UK employment laws. Then, as we've talked about, much of our framework is based in that employment contract. So I think the next thing that they should be doing is making sure that they've got an up-to-date, compliant employment contract and have time to read it. Read the framework, understand the rules of doing that. And I suppose very simply, the reasons why this is so important: it costs you money if you get it wrong. Like, you know, there are penalties, you could get taken to court, you could retrospectively have to pay things that you should have paid and hadn't paid, and less obviously reputational damage that goes with that, right? So you mess up with an employee. In this day and age, it's very easy for a disgruntled employee to tell the world how hacked off they were, and what it was their old employer did wrong, and then maybe that makes it really difficult for you to find the next good employee. So I think that's why it's important to stick to the rules and comply.
Wonderful. All right. Well, that wraps it up. I appreciate both of your guys' time today, and those that were able to stay on a bit longer. I will end it now, but like I said, we will push out the recording, and have the contact information shared to everybody that joined today. All right.
Thank you,
Sam,
Erica. Thanks, Matt.
always great. Erica, thank you so much.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.